I'd like to go back to the medical side of the family, you know, not the dentist, but the doctors. So we're talking your dad, Rich, and...
Dad, Joe, and Rich.
Joe and Rich, okay. Now, what do you remember as a kid about what it was like to be a doctor in Butte? I mean, you weren't a doctor, but...
Well, I remember very well. It was, of course, Dad was a general practitioner, did a little bit of everything. And never in our life, growing up, could we make concrete plans about doing anything. Not that it was bad, but lots of trips to go fishing or hunting were postponed, stopped, halted, because some baby was due or some accident happened or something. And he was on, the doctors worked different then. Joe Kane was a very well organized individual. Up at the crack of dawn, going. Dad, it took dynamite or better to get him out of bed in the morning. Basically because he would sit up and read all night. He was a great reader. And he'd sit up and read all night, then had a hell of a time waking him up and getting him going. And but he would, but anyway, go to the hospital. They always ate lunch at the hospital. The nuns had a dining room for the doctors.
At St. James?
And at noontime, all the doctors that were in the hospital, whether they were staff or whatever, ate lunch at the hospital. Then up to the office at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Stayed in the office till all the people were gone, whether it was 3:30, 4 o'clock. Usually tried to be out there by 4. And then went and made house calls. And I used to go to the office after school, and Dad would take me with him on calls, and all over town. Then he'd come home, and we'd eat. And one time of the day when the whole family was together, that was a must. You better have a good excuse for not being there when we had dinner. Then he'd go back to the office at 7 o'clock. And he'd have office hours until there was nobody in the office. And this was something in later life. I wondered how my mother survived this, because after office hours, Dad would bring everybody in the family home. Joe, John, Rich, Bishop Gilmore. Before he was a bishop, he was a priest around here. After he was a bishop, if he was in Butte, they'd show up at 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night. Neil O'Keefe, and usually whoever was the interns in St. James Hospital, there was always 2 interns in the hospital at that time, and there was always one on duty, so the other one had a little free time, no money, no place to go, so Dad would bring him up to the house. Well, during Prohibition, they were drinking prescription whiskey from Clinton. Had a drugstore next to the Hat Box on Main Street there, right around where Maloney's Bar is now. Well, I don't think they made prescription whiskey in anything but pints, because there was pints of whiskey all over hell, good whiskey. But they all came up, and they didn't drink to excess, but there was a lot of fun and happiness going on. And then sometimes Butter'd be working. If Butter was working, of course, he wouldn't be up the house, but if for some strange reason Butter wasn't working, he might be up the house. They'd be playing the piano. Bishop Gilmore was a hell of a piano player and a hell of a singer, and he'd be singing right along. Some nights they'd bring Father Joyce up there. Father Joyce, I don't know whether you ever remember, you probably don't remember. Father Joyce he was one of these orators where the greatest output of words was and he couldn't, just drive you nuts to listen to him. And but he'd be there. And then Joe Tomitz, Kate's husband, he was quite a operator. He didn't turn down a drink too often. And he'd usually show up there any time of the day or night, but most of the time he'd be stiff. And but he enjoyed everything. He'd sit there and be quiet. Joe Thomas was a quiet person. I mean, when he didn't have a drink in him, he didn't say 2 words in 2 days, but he'd get a drink in him. And he'd been in the balloon corps in World War I, the observation balloons, got shot out of the balloon 2 or 3 times. And he'd sit there and tell you about that. One night, I remember in particular, he was sitting there telling about the balloon and getting shot out of it. And they never chased us kids away from these gatherings. I mean, there's no reason to, but I remember Dick was pretty little then, and Joe Thomas was talking about the balloon, getting shot out of the balloon, and he was sitting on a footstool in the front room. Well, just about the time he got shot out of the balloon, he fell off the footstool. Dick started laughing like hell at him. I don't know how old Dick was. Thomas made Mother put Dick to bed. That went on pretty regular, but as you look back on it, you wonder now, as a wife and a mother, that was quite an ordeal to look forward to every night, to have that crew walk in there, But I can remember the interns. There was different interns, and I was in high school by this time, or starting, and the interns used to come and help me do my homework, and there was some pretty sharp. I remember one intern. He was a Jew, and he was a master mathematician. I never had a bit of trouble with mathematics until he left being an intern here. It was action all the time there, And then Sue Campana lived down the block, and if nothing else was going on, Sue would come up, and Dad and Sue would sit there, and Dad loved to argue. I mean,
Sue was a man?
Yeah,
A woman. Oh,
Sue,
okay.
yeah. And but Dad, it didn't matter which side you took, Dad would argue with you. And Sue would come up, and Sue was the same way. The Campana family were pretty well-to-do. They owned a store there on Park Street and that.
Well, at the hospital, I mean, your dad and uncles took care of a lot of minors?
Well, not too many minors, because, see, the company had a contract with the hospital, and Shields, and with the doctor, and Dr. Shields was more or less the company doctor. And any minor that came in the hospital in an accident or something was basically Shields' patient to start with. Well, then, I could be a little vicious about this. When they found out where the money was coming from, that determined where the patient went. And Dad and the rest of them inherited a lot of patients that were minors because there was no money, what I'm getting at. But the contract, I think the way it worked, I think they charged the minors $1 a day, and they were to cover their hospitalization. Maybe I shouldn't even say that because I'm not sure what.
You mean the hospital did?
Yeah, there was part of the contract, the contract, But Shields didn't have what you'd call a private practice. And then there was another big doctor there, Shanley. And they more or less took care of the miners, the accidents the miners had, of course.
Because they were being covered by the companies.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they made a lot of money at it too, But then, like the miners that were sick with consumption and that, I can remember when I was a little kid now, Ed Kane, Dad's brother, he was a superintendent of mine, first the Bell Diamond and then the Anaconda. And he was what you would call a good superintendent. When they were on strike, he didn't have to hide or anything. He'd go downtown and associate with the miners. In fact, they called his mine Eddie Kane's kindergarten because these miners that'd die and leave a big family around, well, Ed would hire the kids. Well, half of them weren't old enough to go to work, and he wasn't a slave driver or abused them, but they had a job that helped raise the family. And some of when they'd have a strike, every one of those superintendents had a car and a driver in those days. They were all up at the original garage, and the drivers, not all of them, but a lot of them were scabs. I mean, they wouldn't go out with the miners. Well, then, when they had the superintendents hiding in the trunks of those cars to get in and out of past the picket lines and that, and things would get pretty vicious. But Ed wasn't that. Ed had his own car. When there was a strike on, Ed wouldn't use the company car. He had a Packard of his own, and he'd drive up and down, in and out. Nobody bothered him. He got along good that way.
Well, the silicosis, now how did the miner, about the medical politics, how did the miners prove that more men had silicosis than what the company was saying? I mean, who had the x-ray machines and that sort of thing?
Well, I don't think they ever got the proof made, John, because the hospital controlled the x-ray machines, controlled everything. The doctors that were taking care of the miners were in the employee of the hospitals too, of the hospital. St. James, now, the Murray, I don't know how that worked up there, but it was kind of a stacked deck against the miners that way.
Now, did any of your uncles or your dad have an x-ray machine?
Well, after so many years, I guess it would have been in the middle 30s. See, Joe Kane was a radiologist. You'd call him a radiologist today, because he ran the x-ray department in St. James for years. Well, then they bought an x-ray machine and put it up in the Lewishon building where the offices were. And but it was kind of at the tail end of everything. I mean, if it had been there quite a bit earlier, it probably would have made a difference. But it never was. Joe at that time left being the radiologist at the hospital and went more or less into private practice and then running the x-ray machine up in Lewishon building. But I don't think it ever was
wasn't there early enough to take part in the facts.
Yeah.
Well, now you say you went to Annapolis.
Mm-hmm.